I'm on the couch with Ian Weldon, who is about to do a show at the Parr Foundation, and it's going to be called I Am Not a Wedding Photographer. Can you explain exactly why it is you're not a wedding photographer, when in fact we know you are?
I think it's more, I wouldn't say I am what you would class as a traditional wedding photographer. It's more of a project for me, and I started shooting weddings about 7 years ago as a way to make money to work on other projects. It turns out that weddings became a project. And that was, I think after maybe 3 or 4 weddings that I photographed, I started to find within those situations images that were along the lines of photographers that I liked, and I thought that I was probably onto something as far as a project was concerned.
And what would you say is the normal wedding photographer's approach? Which is, say, different to yours?
Yeah, from what I understand, it's a checklist of shots that they must get. An idea that everything should look pretty and nice and somewhat fairy tale like. And for me, it was more of a contrived idea of what the day actually is. But couples want that, or a lot of couples want that. They see it as a fairy tale kind of thing, and they want it photographed in that way.
And when you do these, what appears to be a slightly alternative view on the wedding day, do people appreciate that?
Yes. I think the people who are looking for something different, who don't want that prettifying of the day, and they want the reality photographed. There are certainly people out there who want that kind of thing rather than this whole, what would you call it? Facade.
Fantasy, maybe?
Fantasy, yeah, absolutely.
So let's go all the way back. You say you were working as a photographer, you were doing some of your own projects. Tell me how you got excited about photography in the first place.
I think I didn't come to photography until I was nearly 30 years old. I'd always had some sort of interest in art and photography, but always found that I was doing other jobs. And that everything from being in the army when I left school to driving trucks. And I just got to a point where I really felt that I had to do something different. So I went to college in my 30s to learn about photography, and I don't really think I understood anything about the practice of photography or the practice of documentary photography, because at the start I was shooting white background portrait photography in a studio, and I think after about 5 years of that I became really bored with it, and I didn't feel as though I was progressing. And it was about that time that I felt like I had to make a choice of either try to understand what it is that I was doing or go back to having a job. And in that time I started to become more interested in the work of Bruce Gilden and your work and people like Mark Cohen and photographers that I didn't quite understand at the beginning of photography. But the more that I started looking into that and studying that, the more I realised that this was the kind of thing that I wanted to have a go at, to try and change or to try and contribute something to photography, to make photographs rather than just pretty pictures. Initially I thought the pretty pictures were photography, sunsets, portraits, models, all of that kind of thing.
These portraits you were doing in the studio, were they for commercial purposes? I mean, were people coming to you and saying, I'd like to do a portrait, or...?
It was just family portrait, white background. And initially it was just to make money. Mm-hmm. But then that became a completely empty endeavour.
And what made you think about weddings? Was it just because they were there? I mean, did you get invited to do a wedding? What was the thing that initiated your interest in the notion of weddings?
Well, what happened is I gave in to requests for weddings because I had the perception of the wedding photographer, as I mentioned earlier, and what the wedding photographer did, and the guy who would annoy people at weddings and organise things. And I thought that because I'm getting so many requests, what I can do is I can start doing that kind of thing as a way to make money to work on other projects. So I got into it through just requests, really, and the idea that I thought I would be able to make money doing it.
And then I know you've been to various galleries and showed them your work. What kind of response have you had when you've talked to the photography establishment?
It's a case of either no response at all, or it's not real documentary photography, or it doesn't belong in a gallery, or it's just wedding photography. And they were kind of unable to see past the fact that it was shot at weddings, but for me, it's more of a long-term documentary project.
And here you have a show and a book.
Yes.
Did you ever think that this would happen, in the sense that you're actually now making a name for yourself within the gallery system for being a wedding photographer?
Absolutely not. And this is something that has been a kick up the backside for me somewhat. I've been shooting weddings for about 7 years, and now I felt like I was becoming, how can I phrase it? I was in a situation where I was interested in photography, and as far as the wedding industry is concerned, it was more interested in popularity. It was more interested in trends, and I felt like I was kind of becoming a big fish in a small pond. And now that this has come about, I feel like I'm starting again as a photographer, and that's a good thing. And I've started to realise that the projects that I've put aside because I've been working on weddings, I can now start or I now feel that I have to start doing them. And it's a good thing. It's a good situation for me to be in, because I think I would have become bored with photography if I'd have just stayed within weddings.
So the journey with weddings has really led you to become a documentary photographer again.
Yes, absolutely. Which was the initial goal. It might have taken 7 years, but I got there in the end. It's been a good proving ground, weddings, and I feel like I've really sort of cut my teeth with it, and I can now transfer that skill and that knowledge into other projects with a real understanding of what it is that I want to do.
And I know you also do teaching of workshops and such like. How is that going? And do you have many recruits? Is this something you continue to do in the future?
As far as workshops are concerned, yes. I'm not doing any at the moment. In the past, I've tried to try and get wedding photographers to look at photography history and look at photography in a more documentary sense than just buying into the wedding industry. And that was quite a difficult thing to do, to get wedding photographers to think differently about their approach. Hopefully in the future, I'll be able to go on and develop some more kind of workshops and courses. But I also teach locally beginner photography classes and things like that.
So do you find a traditional wedding photographer is resistant to your approach?
When some photographers, I mean from any genre, have to really start to study and understand photography, I think that's where the resistance comes from. It's the understanding the thing outside of their own genre, and how would they apply that to a system that's it's pretty much packaged and ready to go as far as presets and website design and the images and the way that everything's supposed to look.
One of the other things you do is your podcast. So I know you
Yes.
initially started this with Bradley.
Yes.
Tell us why you decided to do this and how you went about recruiting your guests for the podcast.
Okay. The podcast was originally an idea around just conversations with photographers about photography. And I think that at the time that I started it, this was something that I was trying to do within the wedding photography community. And I found that the photographers within that community didn't really want to talk about photography itself. So the idea was to talk about photography. It was also to produce a podcast that dealt with, in some way, the history of photography, because I would say, from my own experience, understanding the history of photography brought me much closer to photography itself and understanding what it is that I wanted to do. And I thought if I could try and put that out in an accessible way, it would mean more people would have hopefully a better idea and an understanding of what they wanted to do. So I just started contacting photographers and asked if they would like to talk about photography and photography history and their inspirations and where they started from, really.
But interestingly, you've tended to go for more historical figures within the history of photography rather than, say, contemporary post-war people. Why
Right.
did you make that decision to go with the earlier players in the game rather than later?
Right. I think building the foundations of where photography came from was important for me. So that's why I started, obviously, with Louis Daguerre and Niepce and the photographers who's like the portrait photographers, Hill and Adamson, and all the different types of media that was being used as the building blocks of photography. And what I have noticed in the last year or so since I've been doing that is I have really been focused on that for too long, and I have now started to look at more contemporary photographers. So it was just basically through my understanding of how, well, it was through how I understood photography, and now I'm at a point where I do realise that there are as important photographers around today as the people who started the craft, including the artists and scientists. And
because when I look at your work, I really feel you're reading from contemporary practice. You know, you can see the influences of the likes of Winogrand and Nan Golden in your work, which I don't think you'd be disagreeing with.
Absolutely not. No. I think that photographers, especially Winogrand, are photographers that I came to much later, but really saw it was the looseness in their work and the idea that they were just going out and photographing, and there wasn't a huge amount of thought around it, or there wasn't a great philosophy around it. It was just go out and shoot, and as Winogrand said, he would photograph just to see what things looked like photographed. And those ideas are things I think now are the building blocks of the work that I produce. And it's just, I don't know, it's just making photographs that I would like to look at.
Fair enough. And Ian, what's the name of your podcast?
The podcast is Out of Focus Podcast.
.com?
Outoffocuspodcast.com. Out of Focus Podcast on iTunes and hopefully on Spotify, everywhere that you can get podcasts.
How many are there?
At the moment, the number 38 has just been released.
Out of all the ones you've done, which would you say, if there's one to go to and listen to, what would you say it is?
Would it be the Martin Parr episode?
Deary me.
If it's not the Martin Parr episode, then Vinka Peterson was a great episode. No System, her book about the rave scene, that was good. And I think that the earlier ones are definitely more history based, and that started to tail off a little bit as we get into the more recent episodes. You know, but they're all good. A guy, Stephen Ballman, that's a great episode, great early episode. Richard Calvar, Matt Stewart. We've had some great photographers on, Nicky Boone, and I feel quite lucky to be able to have had conversations with these photographers. And yeah.
So when you interview these people, you're obviously doing some research, you're contacting them, and then you go into a dialogue. Do you find yourself learning a lot about photography in this process?
Yes, indeed. I'm learning more about my practice. I'm learning more about photography as a whole, and especially, as we touched upon, I'm learning more about contemporary photographers and documentary photography, and the field that I feel that I'm now moving into. And yeah, absolutely.
But in the end, do you think you want to be better known as a documentary photographer rather than as a wedding photographer? Is there any conflict
would
there?
Would there be a difference?
Well, you tell me.
I would say a documentary photographer, and maybe my first real subject was weddings. I don't think weddings will ever stop. It's a great subject, and I'm interested in the change in kind of styles and maybe fashions, and how traditions change, because things are changing within weddings as far as people are now just doing whatever they want. And I would say that even 15 to 20 years ago, it was still a very regimented, this is the way to do a wedding. And that's starting to change now. So how different that's going to be in 20 or 30 years, I would still like to be able to capture that.
So the rules are loosening and anything goes, if you like.
Yeah, indeed.
And I guess now that you have civil weddings, as opposed to, say, just church, that also means you can be more flexible Interesting.
Yes,
Yeah. So, in fact, you're leading the way because that formality that's been associated with the older style wedding photographer is disappearing.
Yes.
So you're offering an alternative viewpoint, really. So it's great that people actually pay you. Do they realise they're paying you to do your own work, to do your hobby?
Well,
do you tell them?
It's not. Yes, they. Everybody knows. Everybody's in on it. I have had people say to me like, "Well, what did the bride and groom think when they got their photographs?" They knew what they were going to get. I'm not hoodwinking anybody, or I'm not trying to hide the fact that this is how I do it. And that's all about how we present ourselves and how we present ourselves online and the expectations that the couple will have. And I think I'm in a good position where I'm now being hired to do my thing. It's kind of, we want you to do what you do at our wedding. And yeah, everybody knows it's all part of this wider project. And people are happy with that.
Mm-hmm. Has anyone raised any objections when you presented the pictures?
No, luckily that hasn't happened.
Very good.
And I think the more the time goes on, it's less likely that will happen.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Ian. Great to speak to you.
Thank you very much, Martin.
Cheers.
Thank you.